It's all things color work in this month's Knit and Chat. We're going to talk about all the different ways you can add color to your knitting, along with recommended resources and lots of tips and advice. And thanks to Craftsy for sponsoring this video. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and I believe knitting's a form of self-care. You can take time for yourself and your creative hobbies like knitting and still create beautiful garments that you love to wear. Now, it's Knit and Chat this month, but I don't have any knitting right now because instead I have a pile of swatches to show you. So you can knit while I talk and show you the swatches. This topic for this video came about because somebody asked me about the different types of color work knitting. So I thought that would make a great episode just to sit and chat about all of the different types of color work. And I did talk about it in a recent live stream, but I know not everybody watches a live stream, so I thought it would be good to go over it again right here in a full video. So we're going to discuss the types of color work knitting, and there are others besides what we're going to talk about in this video, but I wanted to cover like sort of the most popular, the ones you're probably going to find most often in knitting patterns and different resources. And we're going to discuss each of those, and then I also have some recommended resources as well. So like Craftsy classes or books or anything like that. If there's a specific type of color work knitting that you want to explore, then you can have some more resources that will help you do that. And that's actually what I want to start with, is two recommended resources because they sort of cover a lot of different types of color work. The top of my list is this book, The Essential Guide to Color Knitting Techniques by Margaret Radcliffe. I use this book all the time. It covers tons of different colorwork knitting techniques. You've got stranded, intarsia, double knitting, lots of other things as well. Mosaic knitting, slip stitch knitting, a great section on just using variegated yarns, which we have talked about here in the past. And this is just a great resource that covers all of it. Anything related to color in your knitting, you're going to find it in this book. This is probably my favorite go-to resource when it comes to color work knitting. Even some of the less common things like shadow knitting would technically fall within color work knitting, or twined knitting. Some of those are covered in here as well. We're not going to go over them today because they're not, some of the big color work techniques. They're sort of niche color work techniques, but they're in here as well. So if you want one resource that covers a lot of color knitting, this is the one you want. The Essential Guide to Color Knitting Techniques by Margaret Radcliffe. All of her books, honestly, I think I have almost all of them, and they are all great resources. Now, another recommendation is Mastering Color Knitting by Melissa Leapman. I don't own this book, but I've gotten it from the library multiple times, and it's on my Amazon wish list. I really should just buy it. Now, this covers like the big three: stranded knitting, double knitting, and intarsia. Of course, there's other color work knitting as well, but those are really three big popular ones. So if you want to focus on one of those, then that's another good resource for you as well. And she also has a class on Craftsy that covers those as well. So if you prefer a video based over a book, then you're going to want to check out Craftsy, and we're going to talk about them later. So let's get into our different types of color work. The first one we're going to talk about is slip stitch knitting. Now, slip stitch knitting can be done with one color, two colors, or even more than two colors. And it has its own sort of guidelines. You're only using one color at a time, and whatever other colors are in that row, you're just going to slip those stitches purlwise generally. And with slip stitch knitting, there isn't any rule about where the yarn is held. With some patterns, you're going to hold the yarn to the front as you slip stitches, so you're going to get that float, that strand across the front of your fabric, like linen stitch. That's a really common thing to do there. Or you can hold it to the back while you're slipping stitches. So you're just elongating that stitch and the float is across the back. Or you could combine the two. And while you're slipping the stitches, you're also elongating those stitches. And sometimes with some patterns, you can slip them a couple times and make a really tall stitch that really stands out from the other stitches. Those are, I think, the basic rules for that. You're slipping stitches, you're using one color at a time. You can use one color, two color, three colors, multiple colors. You can elongate stitches, you can carry your floats in different directions. There's lots you can do with slip stitch knitting. So here's an example of slip stitch knitting. This one is pretty basic as far as slip stitch knitting goes. It's just two colors. A lot of the time you're going to see lots of colors, like maybe three colors, and lots of like elongated stitches and different floats going everywhere, but this one's pretty basic. It's garter stitch in this orange color, and then you can see it's stockinette stitch in the little cream bricks in between. So pretty basic. When you are working with the orange, you are slipping the cream stitches or vice versa. If you're working the cream, you're slipping the orange. And you can see right there like how the orange looks slightly elongated between these bricks because you'd have to slip them while you're working those cream rows. This is what the back looks like for this particular pattern. So this one is just one example, but slip stitch knitting, every pattern is so unique, and I have one I like. I don't have the swatch right handy, but it uses 3 colors and it almost looks like plaid, and you elongate some stitches so it has these lines running through it and looks completely different from this swatch, but they are both technically slip stitch knitting. Now for recommended resources, Faina Goberstein, who's a fabulous designer, has a book called The Art of Slip Stitch Knitting. It's a really good resource, some lovely patterns in there, and she also has a class on Craftsy as well that covers the same topic. So whether you like books or videos, she's got you covered. Now within this category of slip stitch knitting, another popular technique is mosaic knitting. Now mosaic is a type of slip stitch knitting because you are following some of the same rules. You are just using 2 colors, and while you are working with one, you are slipping the other one, but it has some other rules as well that makes it unique from other types of slip stitch knitting. You are always holding the yarn to the back of the work. You're never floating strands in the front like you can with other types of slip stitch knitting. And mosaic knitting patterns are they're all sort of very geometric looking. They all use 2 colors. You're slipping stitches to the back. You are working 2 rows with one color and then 2 rows with the next color and alternating like that. So you work your right side row and then you work the wrong side row, and it's exactly the same as the right side row, like the patterning. And then that is the method that you follow with mosaic knitting. So those are sort of the rules for mosaic knitting, but because it's slipping stitches and using one color at a time, it's still technically slip stitch knitting, but it's sort of like a subcategory within slip stitch knitting. Kind of like, I would put brioche here as well, like 2-color brioche, because you are using one color at a time and slipping the other one. So it's technically slip stitch knitting as well, but we're not going to cover brioche today. So here is our mosaic swatch. You can see compared to the slip stitch pattern, it looks very different. There's no stockinette, but you can work stockinette. Mosaic can be worked in garter or stockinette or whatever you'd want probably. It's most often done in garter, but it can be done in stockinette too. But I feel like I see it most often in garter stitch. So 2 colors only, and you're alternating between rows, like you're using the orange for 2 rows and then the white for 2 rows, then orange for 2 rows, etc., etc. This is what the back looks like. Somebody had asked me that recently as well. So for this particular pattern, this is what the back would look like. You can see where some of those little floats are. But if you want to get started with Colorwork, these are the 2 types that I recommend because you have multiple colors, but you're only ever using one color at a time. So you're working with one and then you're slipping the other colors. You can see, this is upside down. You can see right there like how elongated those white stitches look because they've been slipped while you've been working the other stitches, so that makes them a little longer. So as far as book recommendations, you can't go wrong with Barbara Walker's Mosaic Knitting. She's the one who actually created mosaic knitting. This one is technically a stitch dictionary though, like it's just a lot of stitch patterns. Actual discussion about the mosaic knitting technique is like this much of the book right at the beginning. But if you like stitch dictionaries, this is definitely one you should have. It's a really good resource. Mosaic knitting is fun. Tons of patterns in here, stitch patterns. If you want something that's more technique focused, then Mosaic Knitting Workshop is also a really good book. I've gotten that one from the library before and I read through it. It's really good. Lots of good clear information and patterns as well. So you can like apply everything you're learning to a pattern. That's my favorite way to learn. You can use a swatch to learn, or I think it's just fun to cast something on and learn the technique in a pattern too. Now, along with practicing techniques within patterns and reading books, one of my favorite resources is videos, and that's why I recommend Craftsy. When it comes to learning new knitting techniques, one of my go-to resources is Craftsy. If you're new to Craftsy, it's an online platform with lots and lots of classes on so many different hobbies and topics like knitting, crochet, and any other crafty hobby that you can imagine. You'll probably find a class for it on Craftsy. They have over 2,000 classes on a variety of topics, including knitting, and there are lots of classes about colorwork knitting. If you're ready to explore any of the colorwork techniques that we're discussing in this video, then you definitely need to go over to Craftsy and look at the list of videos they have for knitting colorwork techniques. Here's just a sampling of some of the knitting colorwork classes that you can explore. There's Fair Isle projects and techniques, there's colorwork cables, mosaic knitting, slip stitch knitting, brioche, intarsia, and double knitting. When I embarked on my double knitting journey last year to knit this massive scarf for my daughter, the first place I checked was Craftsy for some double knitting classes. And I found two that were great help in making sure my techniques were right and I would be able to fix any mistakes that I eventually would make in this scarf. Taking these classes was a big help. The first was Lucy Neatby's Foundations of Double Knitting, and then Alistair Postquin's Adventures in Double Knitting. They were just the thing I needed to make sure I had all my techniques down and I would be able to tackle this project and be successful at it. If you're ready to explore your next colorwork knitting technique, then you need to check out Craftsy and get the link for Craftsy membership down below this video. The first 1,000 subscribers to click on that link will get a full year's premium membership to Craftsy for just $1.49. So the next very popular, probably the most popular of all of these, would be stranded knitting. So stranded knitting, you are using multiple colors, sometimes just two, but at least two. But instead of just using one and then dropping that color and picking up and using the other, you are holding both yarns and knitting with both of them, alternating to create a pattern. And wherever there is like a long section of one color, you are stranding the other color across the back or the inside of the work and catching it if you have to, using another like a technique to catch the float. That's what it's called. The strands of yarn on the inside are called floats. But that is the major difference, is instead of using one, dropping, and then picking up the other color, you're holding two colors, at least, sometimes more, and stranding the unused color across the back of the work. Now, stranded knitting is used in lots of places all over the world, and they all have their own techniques within stranded knitting. A lot of the time you'll hear people say Fair Isle knitting. Now, and sometimes they're referring to all stranded knitting as Fair Isle knitting, but that's not right, it's not correct. Fair Isle is one location in Scotland that uses stranded knitting techniques, but the way they use them is very specific to that region. So it's called Fair Isle knitting. That could include lots of different colors. They like it's very common to see like muted tones. They're going to use Shetland and Fair Isle yarns that are a little fuzzier and the colors all want to sort of stick and grab together. That's where we get the term steeking. We get color dominance from Fair Isle knitting. You're not going to find color dominance in other stranded knitting techniques, but it is common in Fair Isle knitting. So Fair Isle knitting is a subset of stranded knitting. Not all stranded knitting is not Fair Isle knitting. It's just one particular type based on a specific geographical region. Then there's like Scandinavian style of stranded knitting, which is totally different than Fair Isle knitting. A lot of the time you're going to see a lot of high contrast, like you might just have two colors like white and red or white and navy blue, just very, very high contrast. Whereas with Fair Isle, you're going to see, this one is pretty high contrast as well, but you're going to see like a lot of muted and sort of the colors sort of blend together. Sometimes they might have some high contrast too, but not like Scandinavian patterns where it's like two colors, very high contrast. And they don't talk about color dominance at all. They don't hold their yarns the same way that they would for Fair Isle knitting, where it's very specific, like you always hold them the same way to get that color dominance. You're not going to see that in Scandinavian knitting, though it's still stranded knitting, but it's not Fair Isle knitting. And you're going to see stranded knitting in other places as well, like Iceland, like the Lopi sweaters or the Bohus sweaters. So they all have the basic technique of using multiple colors and holding those colors all at the same time, stranding one while working with the others, perhaps catching floats if the floats are long. But other than that, everything else can be different. There can be different techniques for catching floats. There's steeking in Fair Isle knitting, though it's not called steeking when they're cutting their knitting in other stranded techniques. So you just have to think about the geographical location, but that's the big thing. Not all Fair Isle knitting is not all stranded knitting is fair isle knitting. Fair isle is a subset. Stranded knitting just means they are holding multiple colors and stranding the unused colors with the floats across the back while they use one color, and then switching back and forth to create the pattern. So let's go look at this one. I've been waving it around at the camera and now we can see it close up right here. So this one does use multiple colors, 2 colors per row. Ooh, got a mistake right there. A little bit of corrugated ribbing, which is another Fair Isle technique. So this is what the inside looks like. You can see where I wove in all my floats right there, or my ends, I wove in the ends. So this is, I really like the inside of stranded knitting as well. I think that is just, I think it's pretty and unique. But you can see as one color is being used, the other one creates a float because it's sort of just held to the inside. And if there is a lot of space, then you are going to want to catch that float. So you wouldn't want to have to, like if you were going to wear this, you wouldn't want to be able to poke your finger underneath all those floats. You'd want them short enough so they wouldn't catch on anything and pucker up your fabric. But you do want to keep them long enough so that your project has some give. But this is what the inside of stranded knitting looks like. Now, when it comes to actually holding the yarn, you can do that in multiple ways. You can, hold both strands in your right hand, both strands in your left, one strand in each hand. It's really up to you and what you're comfortable doing. There's even Colorwork rings that you can put on your finger to hold the different strands of yarn. It's just one of those things you kind of have to practice and find what is most comfortable for you. And that is when I actually do recommend picking a project that has just 2 colors and learning how to hold the yarn, learning the comfortable way for you to hold the yarn. I do recommend learning to knit with both hands so you can have options when it comes to things like this, where you can practice holding it in either hand to see which one is most comfortable. And there are lots of things to learn about stranded knitting. You're catching your floats or steeking, or like how long should your floats be. My guideline for that is like 1 inch or less, and that varies. I don't like to use an exact stitch count because if you say 5 stitches in a super bulky yarn could be like that much. That's going to be a super long float. 5 stitches in fingering weight yarn, it's probably less than 1 inch. So I like to use 1 inch as a guideline, so then no matter what yarn weight I'm using, then I know that I'll just keep my floats short enough so they are less than 1 inch, because especially in something like a mitten or a sleeve, you don't want to put your hands in something and then catch them on the floats, because that can cause your work to pucker and disrupt like the stitch patterning. You don't want that. So, but there's a lot you can learn about stranded knitting. One of my favorite resources is Alice Starmore's book of Fair Isle knitting, which is a type of stranded knitting, and it covers so much information. Like this one is packed full. If you like Fair Isle knitting, then this is definitely the resource that you want to have. It's just, it's full of good information, how to use colors, all of the different techniques you would need to know how to use. Stitch dictionary as well if you want to sort of add your own stitch patterns to like a plain sweater. There's lots of patterns in here as well. And the back even has like a section on designing, like you're designing your own garments using the different techniques in this book. Now, if it's stitch patterns that you like, and I love stitch dictionaries because you can get like a plain sweater pattern or whatever kind of pattern you like, and you can pop in your own motifs in there to create something truly unique. So 2 that I really like are 200 Fair Isle motifs and 150 Scandinavian motifs. Both of these are by Mary Jane Mucklestone. These are really good as well. They also have good sections on like the stranded techniques in the front of the books. If you want like a combination technique stitch dictionary, these 2 are really good. Or for something, it's a little outside the box, it's a little more modern, is Knitovation, and then the other one is called Alternate. I've got the digital version of that by Andrea Rangel. These books are lots of fun as well. There's really, you can see some of the stitch patterns on there, like the little, is that a panda at the top? Just very cute, kind of modern and fresh take on stranded knitting. These are specifically stitch dictionaries as well, but there is like some basic information on techniques, and I'm not sure about this one, but I know the first one at least does have some patterns in there. So you can like sort of plug and play and change out some of the stitch patterns and put some other ones in, but these are really fun books too. And we had a couple recommendations from other people as well. Anything Alice Starmore, and then Nana Q57 says, I can't believe I'm Fair Isle Knitting by Sheila Jones. She's a wonderful teacher and the book is a great place to begin. The other is a new one I just received, the Doodle Knit Directory, lots of patterns to mix and match. So I'm not familiar with either one of those, but they both, I've heard about the Doodle Knit Directory and it's very popular right now. And the other book as well sounds really good. So those are some other resources to check out if you're interested in stranded knitting. Now, if you prefer classes, then there are two Craftsy classes that I recommend. I've taken them both. Both of them are by Mary Jane Mucklestone. The first one is Modern Colorwork Techniques, where you're knitting a cowl, and it's just, I think that was one of my first, not my first stranded knitting projects, but one like within like still learning all the techniques. And then she has a class called Stranded and Steeked, where you knit a Fair Isle colorwork vest, and then you are going to do all of the cutting and steeking to like open up the neckline and all of that. And I've taken both classes, knit both projects with the classes, lots of good information, highly recommend them. So our next technique is Intarsia, and this one I often see people like not thinking about it. Maybe they don't know what it is when they want a big motif on they're knitting, and then they try to do this, but they try to do it with stranded knitting. The problem here, as you can probably imagine, is your floats across the back, or I mean, this is pretty small, but still, if you have like a big graphic, think 80s t-shirts or, you know, sweatshirts with those big graphic designs, and you try to do them with stranded knitting, and you've got like a big block of one color and you're trying to strand the other color across the back, you're gonna have to keep catching that float. That can disrupt the fabric, and that's why we have another technique called Intarsia. So you can have these big blocks of color, but you're not going to be stranding the other colors across the back. What you're going to do instead is use small balls of yarn or put them on bobbins. There's lots of little tools you can use. I prefer to skip them all and just like leave the strands hanging. And you're going to like work with one, drop that color, work with the next color, drop that color, and work with this color right here. So in this row, there would be 3 colors. And what you do at the point where you're changing colors is twist the 2 yarns together. Otherwise, you're going to have separate little pieces of knitting. So you have to twist the colors and then just keep knitting. But that's the only technique there is to Intarsia. There's other things as well, you know, like how to twist them and how to make sure those edge stitches stay neat. But when you want big blocks of color in your design, this is what you're looking at. You want Intarsia. You don't want to use stranded knitting. So this one has all of these different colors, and you can see you would have like 3 different balls of yarn right here. You would be working across there and then twisting them here, working across there, twisting them, and then working there. And then in this bit, you'd have actually 4 colors. So the purple, twist it with the yellow, work the yellow, twist it with the pink, work the pink, twist it with the cream, and then work the cream. This is what the back looks like. So there are no floats across the back here. You can see these are where the yarns were twisted together. But you have just the one block of color, and you're going to have a lot of ends to weave in because each of these little sections has their own ball of yarn. So you've got 2 ends for each of those. Here's another example. This is also from the Master Hand Knitting program. This is another Intarsia project. This is an Argyle sock. So Argyle is done with Intarsia. So each of these blocks is their own ball of yarn. And you can see there's a lot of ends that never got woven in on this sock. This was my test sock. But this is how it looks on the inside. Everything is sort of woven along those lines. So each piece gets its own color. Now, admittedly, Intarsia is not a technique that I've used very often. I think mostly just for my swatches for the Master Hand Knitting class. I did have a shawl recently, the Scout shawl, where it is stranded knitting, but it's like a patchwork, so it's done, all the pieces are sort of connected with Intarsia, so I've used that, but I can't say I've ever done like a big project that just uses Intarsia, but it is a good option for those times where you've got big blocks of color and stranded knitting is not going to work. Then you need to use Intarsia instead. And if you're looking for video classes, there are a couple by Sally Melville and Anne Burke on Intarsia on Craftsy. Now, another technique I have used recently is double knitting. As you can see from that double knit scarf that I just showed earlier, I worked on that for almost a year. And here's just a little swatch of double knitting. So this is mirroring the same simple pattern with 2 different colors. Now you can actually have 2 different designs on the fabric, one design on the front and one on the back. I have not done that though. I've just done the simple mirroring style technique. But double knitting is another chance to use color in your work and create really interesting pictures and designs. And it's technically a slip stitch sort of technique. It can be done a couple different ways because you're working both layers of fabric at the same time. In one method, you are like knitting the stitch that's facing you and then slipping the stitch from the other side, and then you reverse that. So you actually have to do everything twice. The other, probably the more popular method is sort of like, it's just kind of like a working rib pattern. You work the stitch that's facing you, usually knit, you move your yarns and you purl the stitch from the other side. So it's going to be stockinette on the other side, but you're seeing the reverse side of it, so you're going to purl that stitch. So it's kind of like just working knit and purl, but I mean, there are some other things you have to do. You have to pay attention to your edge stitches and how you're going to twist things to close them, because if you don't twist it, you'll have 2 pieces of fabric there. And then like how you manage the yarns as you're working one side of the fabric versus the other. Lots of things you can practice. One book I highly recommend is Nathan Taylor's Demystifying Double Knitting. I recently got that one from the library and it's on my wish list to buy because it's a very good book. I like his way of explaining things, and he goes into a lot of detail into like increases and decreases as well, which is something I have not explored yet with double knitting. If you prefer video, I watched 2 classes on Craftsy, one with Lucy Neatby and one with Alistair Post Quinn. Both of them have lots of good information on double knitting, so highly recommend those. So here you can see close up, that's what it looks on this side, and then the other side is the mirror image of it, just the colors are reversed. But like I said, you can actually have 2 different designs. You could have one design on one side and a different design on the other. Now along the edges, you have to twist the 2 colors, kind of like Intarsia, or you'll have 2 separate fabrics. But in like the center right here, I could actually pull these 2 pieces apart because they are not even attached to each other. They are attached where you change colors because you're obviously using that orange on this side and the cream on the other. But where they're not, where like you have just the straight plain color, it's 2 layers of fabric right there. So I can pull them apart, there's space in between. But there's lots of techniques to learn here. There's different cast on methods so you can get like this nice clean edge. Same with the bind off methods, so it just looks almost like you can't even see a bind off, like it's just invisible there. But very fun technique, definitely something you should give a try. So our last colorwork technique would be Entrelac, which I know is not super popular, but I thought I would put it in here anyway because it is a very interesting technique, which is sort of woven fabric. And this can be done with multiple colors, but you just have these little blocks of color, and we'll look at the reverse in a second. But they're all sort of like you would cast on, and you work these little blocks, and then you do these blocks in this row. But it's one of those techniques where you probably want to learn. This is one of the reasons I learned to knit backwards, because you have to keep turning for all of these little blocks, turning back and forth because it's just a few stitches, and then working your decreases to create sort of the shape. I don't really remember how to do it. I'd have to go like read something to refresh my memory because it's been a while. I was not a fan of this, but it is a way to make some color in your project. So here you can see what it looks like. It is like this piece is moving that way and this piece is moving that way. It looks like woven fabric, but they're all connected. They're all kind of knit together in there. This is what the back looks like. So no stranded knitting here. Looks more similar to probably Intarsia, but everything is sort of, you're picking up stitches and connecting your little blocks together. But it is another way to get some color in your project. Now, I don't have many personal recommendations because I think this is the only Entrelac I've ever done was this swatch here, but there is a class on Craftsy with Gwen Bortner. There's also a book by Rosemary Drysdale about Entrelac, so maybe check out one of those resources if you're really interested in this. It does create an interesting fabric. I've just never done another project since this, and honestly, I found it very tedious, but I'm sure if I found the right project that I just knew I wanted that thing, then I would definitely probably try my hand at Entrelac again. And I did ask for your comments and questions as well. So we have a couple to go over. Old Woman 123 says, please tell us what is the worst, to err on the side of holding your yarn too loosely or to hold your yarn too tightly. Well, I'm guessing you're talking in regards to stranded knitting. In that case, I would say too tightly is worse because, well, I mean, where's that little stranded project? If I had held that yarn super tight and pulled it tight, that's when you get puckering. And no, you cannot block it out like that. So the second thing I see a lot is after somebody has done a stranded project and their floats have, I mean, you can get small puckers as you're knitting, that's totally normal, but if you're pulling your strands super tight, then you're causing all of those stitches. Let's say you had to work 5 stitches with one color, then you're switching colors and you're pulling it tight, then you're taking those 5 stitches and squishing them all up. And then you've got a tight float across the back. You cannot make that float any more loose in the blocking process. It's just gonna be tight. So for stranded knitting, I would say err on the side of too loose. But too loose is not great either because then you've got long floats that you can probably get caught on your fingers. So, but for stranded knitting, I do tend to be quite loose and then I find it doesn't end up feeling loose when I'm all done. But what I do is as I'm knitting, if I'm knitting like with one color, before I start the other color, I kind of stretch those stitches out on that right needle and make sure that strand is nice and loose before I start knitting with the other color. And that makes sure that the float stays loose. Another thing I've seen people mention is to like put your knitting inside out and the floats will stay more loose that way. My brain cannot figure out how to do that, so I've never tried it, but for me, just sort of stretching out the stitches on the right needle as I'm changing colors seems to work just fine. But definitely with stranded, you want to be loose. Too tight, you cannot fix it. It's going to be too tight and you're just going to have to rip it out or have a very puckery project. Now for other types of color work, I'm not sure. I guess mosaic and slip stitch, you don't want to have tight floats either. If you're slipping stitches and you do have a float, same thing, you don't want them too tight because it will pucker there as well. Well, Intarsia, in double knitting, you're switching colors and you have to twist them. So you do want that twist to be tight, but I'm guessing like this question is probably related to stranded knitting, and yes, you want to err on too loose in that case. And then one final comment from Lori. Don't have a specific resource per se, except to say start with a small project. Every technique can be put in a cuff of a sock or in a cowl. Find out if you like the technique first before committing time and yarn to a big sweater project, for example. Exactly, that's such a good tip. Like, I only done Entrelac once and I cannot imagine trying to do that for a whole sweater. I really don't think I would like that unless I see a sweater and I fall in love with it and I really want that sweater. Yeah, try it on something small. I like a hat or a cowl because the circumference you can usually do like a 16-inch circular. I do find sometimes, like for socks or anything that's on a small circumference, like where you need magic loop or double pointed needles, if it's a very fiddly technique, then unless you're really comfortable with that like magic loop or DP ends, then that can like sort of make it worse. So if I'm going to do something in the round, I like a 16-inch circumference because then you have like a big enough circular needle that you're not also having to manage like a small circumference at the same time as whatever the new technique you're trying to practice. But I definitely agree with Lori. Try it on a small thing first before you decide to do like a whole adult size garment, because you might realize you either really love that technique or you really don't and you don't want to do it again. But definitely give different techniques a try. Like, you won't know if you like them or not unless you try them. So they're definitely worth trying. So thank you to Craftsy for sponsoring this video, and I would love to hear from you. Do you have any recommended classes or books or resources for any of these colorwork techniques that we've discussed? Or do you have any questions? We can always have another video where we dive deeper into any of these colorwork knitting techniques. So leave a comment sharing your tips and advice or your questions, and if you want to continue hanging out with me, I'm going to let YouTube recommend a video, and you can click right there and I'll see you in the next video.